So, Nick, Conor McGregor is going to be making his return likely in the beginning of 2023. His manager did come out and said he wants to make a permanent move to welterweight, which does open up a whole new pool of potential opponents. And so I wanted to ask you who you thought would be a good match for Conor in his comeback fight.
Well, there's so many good options, and Conor's at a point in his career now where he's only fighting the biggest names in the sport, and he's really only having difficult fights. You're not going to see him in there with somebody who he's just head and shoulders better than, or, at least on paper doesn't seem that way. But I think when you ask about Conor McGregor, you do have to ask a couple questions. What weight class is he going at? I think that's smart for the manager to say 170, because then that kind of lets us know that, all right, he's not really searching for that belt at 155 right now, and there's so many good fighters that are right there on the cusp. It's just best if he avoids that for right now, and he can always jump back down when he needs to. He's not that big of a guy where he can't get back down to 155. But 170 has so many villains. It has so many of his arch rivals in it. And I just think that for the sport, it would be best. And obviously, the sport is always in a better position when Conor has the chance to put a belt around his waist. But realistically, that's not in his immediate future. I think Conor has to win at least one fight before he starts considering a title fight with Leon Edwards or whoever may have the belt at the time after he gets a first win. But right now, we've got, Jorge Masvidal. You've got potentially the winner or loser between Dustin Poirier and Michael Chandler. You've got some people like Nick Diaz who said he'd be interested in doing something again in the UFC. So I think there's a ton of options, but to be completely honest, I have no idea what direction they're going to go.
Yeah, me either, and I would add Tony Ferguson to that list. Conor needs a win in his comeback fight, and he might do what we call cherry picking in the industry. He might see Tony as a vulnerable older man who's been finished a couple of times now and see it as his opportunity to strike. But I personally like the Jorge Masvidal fight. I think anytime you can get heel versus heel, you got a big fight. Both of these guys are two of the biggest stars in the sport. Both of them on their own can do 1 million pay-per-view buys. So when you put them together, it's a major night of business to start the 2023 calendar year for the UFC. And I think Jorge Masvidal, Conor McGregor stylistically makes sense too. I think Jorge's a little bit faster and has a little bit better gas tank than Conor, but I think Conor can hit just a little bit harder with that left hand. And Jorge has been knocked out pretty brutally by Kamaru Usman. So we'll see if his chin can hold up, because, that guy has been fighting for a long, long time. And I'm talking all the way back to Kimbo Slice's backyard. And one thing we know about chins is when you're doing bare knuckle fights in people's backyard a decade ago and you haven't let up since, your chin doesn't get better. So maybe Conor sees an opportunity there. I'm with you. I don't think he's getting Leon Edwards. He's going to try to get that fight. He's going to push for it, but there's no way that you can justify that and give him that fight. And I think what he's going to do, Conor's a very smart guy. He's going to sit back and see who the champion at 55 is and who the champion at 70 is. I personally don't think he wants to fight Islam Makhachev. The only way he would fight Makhachev is if he could be guaranteed that if he beat them, Khabib would come back and fight him. If it was a situation like that, but I think that's grasping at straws. That's a major long shot. So if Oliveira wins, I think Conor does kind of like his chances against Oliveira, because you can sit Oliveira down kind of easily, and Conor feels like he might have the power to finish him. I also think he likes his chances against Leon Edwards, and so if Leon can get past Kamaru, who he's likely to fight in the rematch, maybe he'll shoot for that. But immediate return, I like Jorge Masvidal.
Yeah, I love that. That's really a great fight. And, we have to talk about the landscape of the divisions. And in my opinion, Jorge Masvidal, although he is a major star in the 170 division and basically the second biggest star behind Conor in the entire sport, he's coming off some losses, and he's not really in the running for fighting Leon Edwards. And I know they had that scuffle in the back, the 3-piece in the soda, but there's some other people that are way more deserving, like Kamaru Usman, that should be fighting Leon Edwards in his first title defenses rather than Jorge Masvidal. But what Jorge needs to understand is the much bigger fight is one that he can actually get, and it's with Conor McGregor.
Yeah.
The biggest fight the UFC can make right now is Jorge Masvidal versus Conor McGregor. And I think Conor McGregor's manager is absolutely right that his next fight will be at 170. But depending on who wins that fight between Oliveira and Islam will dictate whether he goes back down there or not. I think stylistically he matches up really well against Oliveira. And Oliveira does get dropped a lot. He gets hit a lot. And when he does sit on the ground for a minute. And Conor's not the one to climb into somebody's guard or start start ground and pounding. He's going to make you stand up with him, and then he's going to continue to try to piece you up. That is a very difficult fight for him, but it's much more winnable, in my opinion, than the Islam Makhachev fight. And I think if he's able to get in there with somebody like a Jorge Masvidal and win, or even somebody like a Tony Ferguson and get a win, then he becomes a number one contender again at 155, and quite frankly, maybe at 170. If he beats Tony Ferguson, even though Tony's not the greatest fighter over his last couple of fights, I think he's like 0-5 in his last 5, he's still a legend of the sport, and all Conor needs is one win. And the UFC knows that if they can get Conor on a one-fight win streak, they can put him in a title fight and not get too much pushback from the fans and the masses. And at that point, it's off to the races, because Conor in a title fight or Conor going up for a belt is really, really what the sport wants.
Yeah, I mean, is fair or unfair, like it or hate it, Conor is only one win away from a title fight. I think he does need to get a win, but if he comes in there and he knocks somebody out and Oliveira happens to get past Islam and now he's shooting back and forth with Oliveira, I mean, Dana White will absolutely put him in there. He's demonstrated in the past that Conor, he gets preference in the industry, but he gets that because he's become the biggest star the sport's ever seen. He's the only star that consistently, no matter who the opponent is, pull more than 1 million pay-per-view buys, and that's just sort of the reality of the matter. Conor McGregor does get to march to the beat of his own drum to some degree, but only so far. You can't come in loss after loss after loss and boom, you're in a title fight. You do need to win one. So I think he's going to be very calculated with who that one is. And I love Masvidal. That fight needs to happen at some point. Those two guys don't like each other for whatever reason, and they're both stylistically similar. Both of them put on electric performances. The trash talking at the press conference would be insane. For me, if I'm picking a fight for Conor McGregor in his return, it's 170 and it's against Masvidal.
Yeah, I love that one. And it's right now they're the two biggest stars in the sport, but things change in this sport. And I know it's going to be a long time before somebody dethrones Conor as the biggest star in the sport and the biggest star the sport's ever seen. But things change, and eventually these two aren't going to be the hot commodities that they currently are. And you got to strike while the iron's hot. These guys should fight. And I kind of like that Conor is really facing his cannons towards legends of the sport, people who have done it for as long or longer than he has. And that's why he's kind of shying away and just kind of silencing the talk of the Paddy the Baddies and Khamzat Chimaev. He's not going to be in there with any of these guys because they haven't done enough for the sport. And I think Jorge Masvidal has done enough for the sport. Tony Ferguson obviously has done enough. And there's a whole slew of guys that he'd be willing to get in there with. And I think he has a good chance against a lot of those names that we just mentioned.
Yeah, it's funny. Conor and Nate are very similar in that regard. They kind of have this code that if you're not an OG and you haven't done something, then you don't get the privilege of fighting them, which is why I think Paddy the Baddy is out. A lot of people thought that may happen, Ireland versus England, and you got the new kind of brash guy who's very different than Conor, but similar in some ways that he can pull eyes and people are interested in what he's doing. But I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing it being a legend of the sport. I'm seeing it being somebody who's proven to also be a draw themselves, and that's why I'm landing on Masvidal.
Yeah, red panty night is a very real thing, but the person who has the final say in that is Conor McGregor, and if he doesn't co-sign and he doesn't want you in there with him, you're not getting that call.
You're right about that. Guys, thanks for watching this video. If you're new here, we're your home for all things combat sports. If that's what you're into, we appreciate a subscribe. Smash that like button on the video, and we'll see you next time.
Peace.